Good early evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming to our current events lecture series, which tonight is being co-sponsored for the first time in many times with the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire, and we're very pleased to be reinvigorating that relationship. I will say that if you're interested in this, you might be interested in next Saturday. We have a gallery talk at 11 a.m. with the co-curator and major collector of our New Hampshire Primaries exhibit series. And so she is going to be doing a gallery talk of the exhibit. And then the day after that, we have the Ballardet Quartet playing at South Church as part of our chamber music series. But tonight we are happy to welcome the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire, and so I am here to introduce their executive director, Tim Horgan.
Well, thank you, Tom, and thank you everyone for taking the time to come out tonight for this fascinating conversation. Every time I've brought this topic up or this event to someone within our network, they have without fail told me that is fascinating and I want to be there. So I'm so glad to see such a wonderful audience here tonight for this important conversation. So for those who may not yet know, the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire is based in Manchester, New Hampshire, and we have a mission of helping people to better understand what's going on around the world. We do that through speakers programs, we do that through international visitor exchanges, and we do that through high school diplomacy simulations, including out here in Portsmouth earlier this year on the Suez Canal crisis, which is a lot of fun. So we are a nonpartisan, nonprofit membership organization. So for anyone who is already a member, and I see a number of faces that I recognize here tonight, thank you for your support. For those who are not yet members of either the World Affairs Council or the Athenaeum, we would love to have your support to continue to help make these types of programs possible. Of course, being nonpartisan, the views and opinions of all the speakers here tonight are theirs and theirs alone and do not necessarily represent the Athenaeum, the World Affairs Council, donors, sponsors, etc. All that fun stuff. I swear to you that Gil and I did not coordinate our attire tonight, but I am fairly certain this is not the first time we've done this either. But it's a good look, right? Okay. So we are very excited to have our wonderful moderated panel here tonight, and I'm going to just pull up Mariana's extensive bio, but I will keep it short because I know you all can read and you can all go online and find this for yourselves. So the key things are Mariana is the Senior Research Associate with the project on managing the atom at the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center, which is impossible to fit onto a business card or a online streaming nameplate as well. So thank you for that challenge. She's also the author of Inheriting the Bomb, The Collapse of the USSR and the Nuclear Disarmament of Ukraine, and is a very, very recent winner and the first female winner of the William E. Colby Military Writers Award, an award that's been given out for the past 25 years. So please join me in congratulating her on that wonderful honor. You can read more about her background online, but she did also just return from Ukraine, so has some particularly relevant and new insights into the ongoing war and, of course, what we'll be here talking about tonight. Also with us, of course, many of you already know Gil Barndollar, Senior Research Fellow at the Catholic University in Washington, D.C., and an Athenaeum proprietor. I'll leave it at that because you all have heard enough from me already. The one last thing that I will mention, beautiful photos here, a local photojournalist, and I'm going to forget his last name, Peter Patterson. Pictures here behind our speakers, And I think we may have a few more downstairs later at the reception. So over to Gil now and enjoy the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. And I'm turning it right over to you, Mariana.
Easy at the beginning. Good afternoon, everyone. It is a great pleasure to be here, and thank you all so much for coming out here on a Friday afternoon. Hopefully, there might be other more fun things to do on a different Friday afternoon, so I appreciate you being here, devoting this time. So we agreed that I will introduce this topic and talk a little bit about the book and some of the main takeaways and lessons, I suppose, of this story, the story of Ukraine's nuclear disarmament, about which I wrote. And then we'll enter into a conversation. I hope you all will also have questions, not only about the book, but about things of how things are in Ukraine. My family is still there. My mom lives in Western Ukraine. I go there quite a bit, so I'd be happy to share these impressions with you. So this book was my PhD dissertation that I started writing a very long time ago, embarrassingly so. I won't say how many years it took me to research and write this book. But one thing I learned in the process is that the past could be as unpredictable as the future. Not only because in the process of research you discover new facts or maybe new documents and things emerge in a different light, but because what happens today sheds a different light and changes the meaning of some of the historical events in the past. And so through this process of writing a book, when I started, the history of Ukraine's nuclear disarmament was a very marginal topic. In fact, I had to fight tooth and nail in my department of political science at Central European University in Budapest to sort of try and convince my supervisors why this is still a relevant topic, why should we know about what happened in the early 90s, why is it still relevant. I was trying to really irk out and finagle this relevance out of this history. And then 2014 rolled along, and that's when Russia made its first moves against Ukraine. It occupied and annexed the peninsula of Crimea, and then stoked the war in eastern Ukraine and the province of Donbass. And suddenly people stopped asking me, why is it still relevant? What was the relevance of Ukraine's nuclear disarmament? And that, with February 2022, this topic kind of reemerged front and center, and questions pertaining to Ukraine's security, questions like, well, what if Ukraine kept the nuclear weapons it inherited from the Soviet Union? Would this war still happen? Came front and center of discussions about this war. I'll kind of outline briefly what exactly had happened, right? You all probably remember, except for Lucas here, who's my son, the Cold War, right? This competition between two nuclear-armed superpowers. I'm old enough to have had civil defense classes in my Soviet classroom, where we ducked under the tables and marched into the bomb shelters, learned how to put gas masks and so forth. That was, in the 80s sometime. But there was kind of an increase of tensions in the early 80s. If you remember, there was the Euro missile crisis, the Able Archer exercise in Europe. So there was sort of the second Cold War, as it were, that increased tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States. And then really quite suddenly, in a historical perspective, things changed. Gorbachev came to power. Suddenly there was arms control. Suddenly U.S. was signing treaties to reduce nuclear weapons. Suddenly, Soviet Union was pulling out of Eastern Europe. Suddenly the wall came down in November '89. And then 2 years later, the Soviet Union itself ceased to exist. These were monumental geopolitical shifts in Europe and globally that happened quite quickly in the grand scheme of things, right? And so one of the consequences of these great geopolitical transformations was that a single nuclear superpower disintegrated into 15 constitutive parts. And 4 of those ended up being hosting shards of this giant nuclear arsenal and the military-industrial complex and capabilities that delivered it on their newly sovereign territories. So today we think it's kind of commonsensical and it was linear that there was a nuclear Soviet Union and then there was a nuclear Russia as a successor state to that nuclear Soviet Union. But in the early 1990s, this was not a foregone conclusion. That's how things ultimately developed because the non-Russian Soviet successors, such as Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan, these were the 3 former Soviet republics that ended up with parts of Soviet nuclear arsenal on their territory, decided, as a result of international negotiations with the United States and with Russia, to surrender that nuclear inheritance, to transfer all of the warheads to Russia, dismantle intercontinental ballistic missiles and strategic bombers and all sorts of other delivery systems designed to, hurl these nuclear bombs across continents and oceans, to target places like, Boston and New York and Washington, D.C. And in the end, only one nuclear power emerged out of the Soviet collapse. Now, when I started researching this episode in nuclear history, there are basically 2 narratives or 2 positions very deeply entrenched that tried, I suppose, to explain what had happened. And one of them was kind of took root in Ukraine, and especially after 2014, that went something like this. Ukraine inherited from the collapse of the Soviet Union the world's 3rd largest nuclear arsenal, just true, and gave it up for nothing but empty promises. And now look what's happening. Ukraine is being invaded and is a victim of Russian aggression. The other narrative, mostly prevalent on this side of the ocean, was that these were Soviet nuclear weapons, not really Ukraine's. These were not Ukraine's weapons to give up. Ukraine did not have command and control over these weapons. And it didn't really have much of a choice. It didn't have options to whether to keep them or not. Those weren't weapons Ukraine could make any use of. So the denuclearization of Ukraine was what social scientists call overdetermined. There were just too many things pointing in that direction, and there weren't any other choices. And both of these narratives have something to them, but both of them tell a very simplified story. And as someone who spent a very long time researching this, I can attest that the truth is somewhere in the middle, and it's a lot more complicated than this. It is true that Ukraine did not have the direct operationals, they call command and control, over these weapons, but Ukraine did have options, and it did have agency, it did have choices in the matter, as the 2.5 years of negotiations over the nuclear matters attest. And that's kind of my first takeaway. When we think about these events of the early 90s, we need to remember that it's not only the so-called great powers, right, that decide the fate of the world. That smaller states have choices too. Ukraine, in addition to the actual weaponry that was deployed on Ukrainian territory, Ukraine inherited a huge chunk of what we call military-industrial complex. So one of the 3 main manufacturers of missiles, of intercontinental ballistic missiles, was based in Ukraine. And at the time of Soviet dissolution in 1991, about 70% of strategic warheads, those are the ones that fly long distances, the ones that are targeting the United States, were deployed on Ukrainian-made missiles. So the bulk of Soviet deterrent was riding on missiles made in Ukraine. Ukraine had, airplane making facilities, so it had kind of capabilities to build delivery systems for the warheads. It had uranium milling and mining, it had nuclear physics, it had research institutes, so it had a lot of elements that Ukraine could have used and pulled together and invested into and leveraged to build up a full nuclear program. It chose not to do so. Why? This brings me to a second takeaway, that Ukraine, the decision about nuclear weapons was not really just an internal national security decision. It was also a matter of international concern. Why? Because possession of nuclear weapons is regulated internationally by the international non-proliferation regime. It has implications broader than just, sort of national security. It's different than just having tanks and helicopters and artillery shells, something that a state can decide for themselves. Over the decades that ensued the use of nuclear weapons by the United States and Japan, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, international community built up a very robust regime, a bunch of treaties, a bunch of rules and norms and categories designed to regulate who gets to have nuclear weapons and who doesn't, designed to curb the spread of nuclear weapons around the world. And the cornerstone of this international regime is the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. It's the most comprehensive arms control treaty in history. There's currently 193 member states, I think, of the 200 total in the world, right? So everyone basically, most major states are party to this treaty. And the treaty recognizes only five nuclear weapon states. And that's the United States, the USSR, now Russia as a successor state, France, UK, and China. So those are sort of recognized, quote-unquote, legitimate nuclear weapon states. Everyone else who joins this treaty pledges not to develop nuclear weapons, with an understanding that we all should try to join forces to curb the spread of nuclear weapons around the world. That the fewer buttons on fewer fingers on nuclear buttons is a kind of public international good for everyone. And so when the Soviet Union broke up, it became immediately a proliferation challenge, and it was a matter of US policy, but also supported by the broader international consensus that there shouldn't be more than one nuclear weapon state emerging from the Soviet collapse. And Ukraine could sort of potentially develop this nuclear option only outside of this regime, sort of outside of the kind of community of civilized nations and so forth. Now, interestingly, quickly things changed after Ukraine made its decision. India and Pakistan conducted nuclear tests in 1998 and declared their nuclear possession outside of the regime, right? Israel remained a nuclear power. They developed nuclear weapons back in the late 60s, early 70s, kind of had the policy of nuclear opacity, so it didn't really say it had nuclear weapons, nor did it deny it, right? But was kind of left outside of the regime as well. So, and finally, North Korea withdrew from the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons in 2003, 2006 tested a nuclear weapon, and is now developing an indigenous nuclear arsenal. So we have 5 states inside the sort of recognized legitimate structure and 4 states outside. With Iran coming online, it might be 5 for 5. So we might see an erosion of this international regime, which would be quite unfortunate because, at least in the case of Ukraine, it really did work to shape Ukraine's choices. Ukraine wanted to be an international citizen in good standing. It didn't want to be a rogue state somewhere outside of the regime. And so that kind of conditioned Ukraine's choice as well. There were other impediments, there were other challenges, such as severe economic crisis after the Soviet collapse, right? A nuclear program would have taken investment, right? And it would have been a very difficult argument to make to your population that you're channeling valuable and scarce resources into a nuclear program when civilian economy is suffering. There was pressure from the outside. Certainly the United States would have sanctioned Ukraine, would have imposed sanctions and costs, or at least would have withheld very much needed structural funds for the Ukrainian economy. And finally, my last takeaway, so the first one was about agency, the second was about the importance of international rules and norms and regimes that structure nuclear possession. And the third one is that agreements in international space, even treaties, are really a lot of times what you make of them, right? There isn't an automaticity to whatever is signed, right? You have to really work to imbue whatever is signed between sovereign states with significance, with meaning, to operationalize it, as it were. Because Ukraine negotiated very hard, and it got the so-called Budapest Memorandum on Security Assurances in connection with its accession to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, which was an important political document. It wasn't a treaty, it wasn't legally binding, but nevertheless, it was signed by heads of state. It was signed by President Bill Clinton of the United States, President Boris Yeltsin of Russia, Prime Minister John Major of the United Kingdom, and Ukrainian President Leonid Kuchma. So, it's not a trifling thing to get a presidents of 3 nuclear states sign something for you. And even though the language was rather general, right, it was basically a copy-paste job from the UN Charter, which, UN Charter is, again, an important document. And it is legally binding, last time I checked, for the states who ratified it. And the 1975 OEC Helsinki Final Act, right, all the good things about respecting Ukraine's international borders and sovereignty, territorial integrity, abstaining from coercion, abstaining from threat and use of force, right? All of these commitments taken on in this memorandum. In the end of it, it's a document that's, a page and a half. And Ukrainians sort of signed it and thought, oh my gosh, we have something that in Ukrainian it says guarantees, in English says assurances. In Russian it says guarantees, though. So, and they sort of shelved it for 20 years, 1994 to 2014. And they didn't work to use it perhaps as a framework, as a base, as a underpinnings of a deeper defense and military cooperation with the United States, or with the signatories, certainly Western signatories, if you will. And then when 2014 rolled around, Ukrainians pulled it up from the shelf and said, hey, we got something that says guarantees on it. This Budapest Memorandum is a really important document. But at that point, it was just that. It was a piece of paper that was not imbued with anything more substantive. And in 2014, then, it was the other signatories, in particular, the United States, that was the chief interlocutor with Ukraine at the time of the negotiations, under President Obama, that chose, again, to make very little of the commitments pledged under the memorandum, right? It was as if in 1994, the US wrote out a blank check and said, when it comes due, we'll write in the number. And then, but there's a choice of how much to write in. And in 2014, it seems that the United States in particular chose to write in a very low number. It said, we, are concerned, we condemn the violation of the memorandum and this breach of territorial integrity of Ukraine. And that was pretty much it. So the military assistance Ukraine received from 2014 to 2022 was about $2 billion. That's what Israel gets in 1 year. Right now we're in probably around $100 billion of aid to Ukraine. And it's unfortunate because when a hot war breaks out, your options go really from bad to worse. There's really no good options on the table. So in retrospect, it was probably would have been more prudent to signal resolve from the Western side to stand by to Ukraine when the conflict was still very, very limited. It's not a stretch to think that the reaction to the breach of the Budapest Memorandum and those commitments in 2014, a very muted reaction from the West, might have emboldened Russia to escalate in 2022, thinking that, you know, we've seen how the West reacts to these kinds of violations. And so, unfortunately, today, we have very bad optics for nuclear non-proliferation. There you have a country that really had a nuclear option. It gave it up for, you know, after negotiating a deal, but also for the kind of country it wanted to be. It wanted to be a good international citizen in good standing, not a rogue state, with assurances that its security would not suffer for this decision. And in 20 years, and then again 28 years, that proved that the optics are such that this was a mistake. And so my contention, and I'll stop with this, I'll kind of conclude with this, is that the value of nuclear weapons as tools of international politics are very much decided today on the battlefields of Ukraine. Because if Ukraine loses this war, it's already suffered enormously. But if Ukraine fails to survive as an independent state, then it will be a terrible sign for others that would bolster the value of nuclear weapons and the value of proliferation. Now, if Ukraine stands and its partners stand with it, despite the nuclear threats emanating from Moscow, right, then perhaps the lesson is even a smaller non-nuclear state can defeat a nuclear bully if we join forces and if we stand together. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mariana. I'm going to give you just a couple of questions and then open it up to the audience and to the folks we have watching online. Do you sense, when you go back regularly, and do you sense that there's both, whether in the population at large in Ukraine, or even more specifically in the security state, is there a sense of buyer's remorse about the giving up of nuclear weapons, and maybe specifically more so in 2014 than when the full-scale war began in 2022?
There certainly is, and much of it stems, kind of in popular conversation, stems from very limited understanding of what exactly had happened. And it's not crazy. I mean, usually we tend to simplify things in the past as we discuss them in the media and so forth. Nobody's going to read, long history books and say, well, but actually. So the narrative of we really gave up nuclear weapons for nothing and it was a mistake is very much entrenched in Ukraine. And you also see, just recently, President Zelensky came out at European Council meeting and said, either you admit us to NATO, we're going to reconsider our nuclear program, our nuclear status. Now, it's hard to know exactly where he's going with it, because certainly right now Ukraine has neither the capacity nor political will, nor any realistic possibility in this moment to, start a nuclear program. Likely this is sort of a way to gain more political leverage to argue for NATO membership. But more broadly, I think, is just trying to remind the world about this nuclear history of Ukraine and about the Budapest Memorandum, about its violations. So sort of bringing back that theme. But I always say that, even though today we might say, oh, Ukrainians regret it, they might, reconsider it, but that is not feasible, certainly not feasible today during the war. It's not feasible probably in the 10 years to come. But the future is long. Nuclear weapons have been with us for 80 years. Every nuclear state, and they're staying, unfortunately, as much as we hate to admit it, every nuclear weapon state today, every nuclear possessor is investing heavily in modernization of their arsenals. That's an investment for another 50 years. You know, once you've developed new missiles and deployed them, you're not going to really scrap them anytime soon. And China's building up like crazy. It's probably going to double its arsenal in the next 10 years. So nuclear weapons will be, unfortunately, a feature of international politics for a very long time. And who is to say that in 10, 20 years, 25 years, 30 years, Ukraine, you know, still feeling vulnerable and still feeling you know, without any security guarantee from another state or from an alliance, might actually resort to developing nuclear weapons. It would not be the course of events I would like to see, but.
You brought up President Zelensky's recent statement and the, you know, threat of a future development of nuclear weapons, or NATO, right, or security guarantees. I'm struck, though, that there's this dichotomy between the history of the, as you said, the empty Budapest Memorandum, and yet the reliance, you know, pinning maybe most of Ukraine's hopes on NATO membership. You know, there's a long back and forth, and I think unresolvable about the degree to which that drove a Russian invasion, but it's certainly part of the equation, whether to a greater or lesser degree, is the NATO piece, right? But I'm wondering how you square that, the willingness to believe and accept that NATO and the Article 5 of the NATO Treaty is worth something, and that even more so, extended nuclear deterrence to the United States is worth something.
I mean, the United States has expended a lot of effort trying to convince its allies that Article 5 is serious, and that U.S. will come, you know, and provide security should there be a need to do so. I guess in Ukraine's case, I think the optics are such that however this post-Cold War settlement emerged in Europe, it ended up having the expanded NATO on the one side and kind of a resurgent, belligerent Russia on the other side. And in between, you have this giant security vacuum, the size of Ukraine, plus little Moldova and plus little Georgia, right? I mean, Belarus is kind of absorbed into Russia's strategic and space. But, you know, as a political science student, you learn this kind of maxim very early on. Power abhors a vacuum. You leave a vacuum of power, security, deterrence, something's gonna move in there, right? So certainly Ukraine could have done more, you know, there was talk about Finland and kind of this armed neutrality with Sweden to bolster its own defenses, right? Certainly could have done a lot more of that than it had in the 30 years of its independence. But the fact remains, you know, just look at the map. Look at the size of Russia. I mean, it's many times bigger. Its population is 130 million to Ukraine's 35 million now. I mean, now with the war, who knows? Its resources are incommensurable. And Russia has this claim on Ukraine, you know, as its former colonial dominion. This is very much a neo-colonial war for Russia. So as much as NATO enlargement in Europe has been an irritant to Russia, for sure, no denial about that, but I don't think NATO enlargement was neither a necessary nor a sufficient reason for this war. This war would have happened if Poland and the Baltic states were not part of NATO, certainly on Ukrainian territory. And then if you look again at the way this war is prosecuted, you know, Russia has taken very good care not to target any even legitimate military targets on Polish territory. All the arms coming through Poland into Ukraine, huge arms depots on the Polish territory, it seems that deterrence works. It seems that Russia is being careful not to target Polish territory. The same goes for the Baltic states. They have large Russian-speaking population. If Russia wanted to pick a fight there, like it did in Ukraine, it could have. So there is something to be said for the value of alliances and of U.S. security guarantee, even if it's not precisely the nuclear bit of it. Then I think the idea for Russia to have then suddenly to face multiple, you know, this collective of NATO even in conventional arms, is probably a deterrent enough.
One final question from me. You mentioned the bad example of Ukraine's nuclear disarmament leading to, and being followed up 20 years later by partial invasion and then full invasion. When I'm struck that when you look at, we've got, as you said, the Soviet successor states, 3 of them disarmed, later gave back their weapons or the USSR's weapons. South Africa disarmed, and you have maybe some quasi examples in Brazil and in Libya. And for medium-sized states that I think technically could make nuclear weapons, I think vast majority of people say Iran could cross that threshold whenever they want to, right? It probably states with far fewer resources than they have. All of those examples, or most of them, suggest that, and North Korea's example in the other direction suggests that nuclear weapons are a major enhancement to your security or guarantee regime survival in most cases. So do you think that the picture has changed a lot since the 90s? The U.S. hyperpower or global preeminence is no longer the case. Do you think medium-sized states are changing their calculations pretty rapidly in this regard? Do you think that Ukraine is one example among many that is driving probably further proliferation?
Quite possibly so. I mean, certainly I don't see an immediate domino effect of proliferation based on what happened to Ukraine. But again, as I said, the future is long and the lessons are not particularly encouraging. Now, one of the things that, one of prior beliefs about nuclear weapons is that, only industrially developed Western kind of capitalist states are capable of this kinds of science and capacity to create nuclear weapons. Not so. I mean, China, 1964, very much a developing country at that point. That's when it developed a nuclear weapon.
Bhutto said we'll eat grass in Pakistan, right, if necessary.
Exactly. And Pakistan, India, huge chunks of populations in abject poverty, huge inequalities, but it's capable of producing, building a nuclear program. I mean, not to mention North Korea. I mean, they're literally eating grass, not figuratively, and they're still developing nuclear weapons. Iran is doing so under a very punishing sanctions regime. So the story of that is, if a country puts their mind to it, even the United States, as much as it could try to impede this, is limited in what it can do. It's not an omnipotent actor on international stage. And just anecdotally, when there was a first round of negotiations with Iran that led to JCPOA, the Iran deal, in 2015, so right in the final stages of negotiations, I had a chance to talk to one of the European representatives to these talks, because it was a 5-party talks. I think that the European Union was also party to these talks, and the representative from the European Union who took part in these negotiations, and it was in late 2014, she related to me that one of the Iranian negotiators came up to her between the sessions and said, "You're pressuring us to give up, enrichment and to curb our nuclear program. Look what happened in Ukraine. Do you think we're stupid?" And it's not because Iran has any love lost for Ukraine, but again, the optics of kind of security imperatives that are at work are really unfortunate with the Ukrainian case. And so one way the United States has been able to effectively curb proliferation was to actually offer its security guarantee to allies such as South Korea, such as Taiwan, such as Japan, such as West Germany back in the Cold War era. But not every country, U.S. can't just go around giving out security guarantees to prevent proliferation. For instance, one of the proliferation concerns in the Middle East and the Gulf region today is Saudi Arabia. will U.S. make Saudi Arabia its treaty ally and offer it Article 5 type of guarantee just to stop it from building nuclear weapons? Probably not. And, Pakistan and India also clamored for security guarantees back in the day. And U.S. said, we're not going to do that. We're not going to, extend nuclear deterrence to Pakistan. And so it's these states in between, right, that are neither foe nor friend for the United States. If it's a foe, you can imagine a military action against, like, Iran, under bogus pretensions, but Iraq, for instance, right? U.S. was very close going to war against North Korea, or at least bombing their facilities in 1994. But it wouldn't do that against Turkey or against Saudi, right? Nor would it offer them, Turkey is a NATO member, but a very particular one. Anyway, so that's unsatisfactory answer to your question.
No, I'll just say, according to some reporting, Putin is I don't know if fond is the right word, but had a period of obsessively rewatching Gaddafi's death, someone who had given up at least a limited attempt at nuclear weapons and was deposed shortly thereafter. So that goes in that direction as well, never mind guarantees. I'll open it up here to questions. I believe we're limited on microphones, so if you can just speak very loudly, both for our sake and for the folks watching.
Actually, Gil, could you repeat any questions?
Okay, too easy.
I heard something on some geopolitical thing. We're making a mistake that if Ukraine has it or was about to, an application to join NATO, and the argument is that Russia, that's what caused Russia to go to war. I don't believe that. I think it's much more historical and empirical than it might be. I would, if the vote in this room, we need to see how many people raise their hands again. They're taking the position of allowing it. I think Russia, who really argued it out, what he's doing is bad enough. Having nuclear weapons would be a huge mistake. And our big mistake was not trying to stop them in Crimea, I believe. The model was very weak and prevent them from a mistake. But if the vote we're taking now was you could build something into that agreement rules that period, Article 5 would not be invoked for a period of time or be downward. But basically, the Europeans, in some cases, the Poles and the Baltic states are crying for it. Finland and Sweden now been brought in as a result of the war. Right? They were not part of this, to insert themselves. So to say we're afraid of admitting them, assuming that's one, that's what they do. But it would take a lot. It would clarify. You have to clarify the boundaries, and immediately whether Poland and the peripheral states. To me, what we're doing we're even getting to the point now with Israel. We don't have enough munitions, enough armor to satisfy both groups by pouring money and arms into Israel. And Ukraine has been $100 billion spent. It's an ongoing war that has no end. So I just, depending on who comes in as president, kind of know what Mr. Trump's attitude is. And so I think it'd be great, to me, it'd be a great step forward by Biden, even though he's not going to be there, step forward today. Let's make the step that I think some of the Europeans would I don't know if that's what you think about it. I don't want you to.
No, I've got to summarize. So thanks, Dan. I'll wrap all that up by just saying the question is essentially the rationality of opposing Ukrainian NATO accession based on fears of Russian escalation or Russian responses to that, given what's gone on in the last couple of years, Finland, Sweden joining the alliance, certainly eastern members of the alliance being pro-Ukrainian accession, although I'll say that obviously any member voting against it blocks it, and there are a half dozen easily who are pretty adamant about that.
For sure, it's not an easy decision, right? Like absorbing Ukraine, even under the best of conditions, into NATO is not like taking in Albania, Montenegro. It's a huge country, with a very salient geopolitical position, and it's very consequential. So I think that was part of the challenge of bringing in Ukraine into NATO quickly. I see, so the main actors, to my knowledge, who oppose extending an invitation to Ukraine, actually not the half a dozen countries, the likes of Turkey or Hungary, who would certainly pose some problems, but the United States and Germany. Those are the key allies who are right now reluctant to make this happen. So the way I understand your comment/question is that what are the escalation risks, right? Even if tomorrow Biden says before he, signs off, and whoever is elected next, even says, all right, we're opening up membership invitation to Ukraine. There will still be a transition period, right? It's not like flipping a switch. So you have to absorb Ukraine into kind of operational, day-to-day operations of NATO. You have to institute certain standards, communication links, bring in intelligence sharing. I mean, all of the things that alliance entails. And in that time, before the actual actionable deterrent could be put in place, in that time, what could Putin do? How can he escalate, given that he won't like it one bit, which we can safely assume? Right now, I mean, it is a large-scale conventional war. Russia is grabbing North Korean troops to throw at the front. It's already, struggling. Ukrainians are not doing great at the front line. They're retreating in the east. But it's not like Russia is doing great. Russian economy, Russia's prime rate is at 18% right now. Their macroeconomic whatever indicators might look good on paper, but that's maybe for another year. So Russia is struggling, right? Can it just escalate to what? To more conventional missiles? I think it's really at capacity conventionally engaging Ukraine right now. Can it go nuclear? There's always that risk, right? But I think there are significant costs associated with it, even for Russia. I know that there's one country that's not deterred by Russian nuclear threats, and that's Ukraine. Because for them, it's like, choose your way to die, right? You die in a nuclear explosion, or, quickly, or you die over the next 2 years pushing back. I mean, you still have to resist. You still have to defend your country. And some of these, cities that have been destroyed by the Russian artillery and bombs, Mariupol, Bakhmut, Avdiivka, Vuhledar, Vovchansk, that's pretty much, I mean, if you look at those pictures online, as I'm sure you've seen them on mass media, that's what a tactical nuke would do. That's a Hiroshima-sized bomb, except, the difference is efficiency. It just takes more bombs to achieve that conventionally than with a single nuclear bomb, and radioactivity. So I don't think Ukrainians would be deterred that much by the threat of a tactical nuclear use on their territory. But for Russia, it would still be, you can't discount that scenario, and I'd be happy to discuss the more and less likely scenarios of nuclear use. But I think it would still be a hugely costly move for Russia. So I think we also should remember that this country has a nuclear deterrent too, right? And that put together democracies, the economic, military, institutional might of Western democracies is many, many times that of Russia. It's just the way of how to best leverage it without increasing the risks.
Whoever's we've got a phone or something going off the back, if someone could silence that'd be great. Sir?
Oh, maybe it's outside.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you a lot about that.
Yeah.
Sure. assume, maybe incorrectly, that most Americans are not aware of it. And I'm wondering what you think about how we got from point A to point B. There were assurances; they were watered down by the Clinton administration, but they were still they weren't guarantees; they were assurances. And you had Crimea take place. You never had the Obama administration inform the American people that we have an obligation. Okay, because he didn't want to do anything, so fine. But Biden sent mixed messages that don't do it. We're facing a situation where the American people are losing interest in supporting this war. The Republicans are not interested in supporting this war, and there hasn't been anything from this administration on the bully pulpit side telling the American people that 20 years ago we made a promise, and if we're going to go around making promises, if we're not going to deliver on the promises, then no one's going to believe us or trust us or anything. What in that context, why do you think that happened? Why is there this failure to? It's such a simple thing to educate the American people, and maybe more importantly, why didn't the Biden administration hold up the piece of paper and say, guys, this is sacrosanct to us, and if you go in, we're all in. So sort of what are your thoughts on all this? Because it seems nuts to me.
If I can just quickly summarize, thank you, sir. The question is about the Budapest Memorandum and the broad, almost universal American ignorance about it, and the failure of the Obama and especially the Biden administration to invoke that and raise that document and refer to the history leading up to this, both 2014 and 2022, and speak about the value of American security assurances and use that from the bully pulpit to justify American support for Ukraine.
So that's a great question to which I have no answer. I don't know.
Stump the expert.
I suppose at some point there will be a Biden presidential library, or Obama presidential library will go and will look at their memcons and the documents from NSC, and will know what arguments they use to pull this. It's not a crazy thing that American public should know about the Budapest Memorandum, right? It happened some time ago. How many people know about CFE, Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty, or ABM, or, Open Skies until it fell apart, or INF until it fell apart, or, these are arms control agreements, and these kinds of agreements, there's sort of this nuclear priesthood, right, that deals with them, and a lot of times they're not part of the broader public conversation. But I see, especially under Obama, I really I couldn't see the downside of actually pulling that document up and even framing the military assistance such as it was as part of delivering on these commitments under the Budapest Memorandum. There would have been no harm in that, other than to bolster the international non-proliferation regime and said, listen, here's the country who did the right thing. We don't want nuclear weapons, in more countries. They did the right thing. And therefore, this is kind of the commitments that we pledged, and we're now sending them javelins. By the way, bipartisan decision. U.S. Congress couldn't agree on anything, agreed on one thing. Defensive lethal weapons to Ukraine, javelins. That's an anti-tank weapon. That's even a step down from Stingers, in which the United States gave away to Mujahideen in Afghanistan in the early 80s. The Stingers are, helicopter killing weapons. And javelins are these kind of man pods. You put them on the shoulder and you shoot the tank. Right now we're talking F-16s. At that point, it was javelins. It was like hardly anything. And even that was not released to Ukraine. And it took until, I'm sorry to say, Trump administration to release those weapons. And later on, I think 16 or 17. So I really don't know. I can't see a good reason for sidelining it, because again, it's so broad. It doesn't really commit you to anything specific, but you could at least bracket the assistance in those terms, and that way also elevate the significance of the Budapest Memorandum, the significance of doing the right thing in the nuclear non-proliferation space, and so forth. So, beats me.
Sir, back. Thank you, sir. The questioner was a former engineer on the Trident missile program, asked about basically the blurring of Russian red lines, I think, as a result of saber rattling and threats that haven't been actuated. And as those lines get blurrier, are we in a higher possibility, higher chance of stumbling over those lines if they're less bright and less clear?
That's a great question. I'm going to try and tackle it. I'm not sure how successfully. It seems to me that we, kind of the Western society, as status quo powers, right? Those who try to sort of preserve the way the world as it generally is now, right? Because we're in a relatively good position in this world. We try to emphasize transparency, red lines, give away something, or enough, right? Not nothing, in order to preserve what we call strategic stability, right? You have to have some kind of predictability. You don't want to create an ambiguous situation in which, your opponent might be encouraged to strike first, or in which you enter an uncontrollable arms race, right? And then everyone's the worse for it. So we try to communicate with competitors and opponents in such a way, at least in the strategic nuclear space, as to preserve the strategic stability. It seems that Putin's game is not strategic stability. He's not a status quo power. He's a revisionist power. He's trying to upend the kind of order, in which we live. So his game is manipulation of risks. And that's the opposite of strategic stability. You weaponize this instability and you make the other side guess exactly what you're trying to guess. Where are his red lines? When do we stumble? When do we, step a step too far? I think that's a very dangerous game to play. That he, dangerous for him and for all of us, especially in the nuclear space, because he really kind of cheapened nuclear threats. Everyone and their uncle are now threatening to nuke Warsaw and London and, forget about Ukraine, everything. From TV presenters to talk shows to former President Medvedev, who's more Catholic than the Pope, in that regard. So we're left wondering, on the one hand, they can't possibly mean that, right? So you tend to, over time, when they threaten not deliver, Ukrainians are in Russian territory. They're in Kursk Oblast. Was there a nuclear response? No. I mean, it would have been unacceptable if you proposed that to the Russians 2 years ago. And now it's a fact. Ukrainians bombed a strategic bomber base in Engels, reached with the long-range drones. They touched Kremlin with the flagpole on the Kremlin at one point in time, and nothing. So that kind of cheapens their nuclear talk, nuclear rhetoric, and also puts us in the situation where we know even less where those red lines are. And now we have changes to the nuclear doctrine that were previewed by President Putin that expand even more the kind of universe of scenarios in which a Russian political military leadership might be authorized to order a nuclear strike. Now it's some kind of combined massive air or whatever strike in the circumstances that not just threaten the very survival of the state, but sovereignty and vital interests, whatever the precise formulation was. So it gives more interpretative space, perhaps, and more options to the Russian leadership, but it doesn't do us any favors and doesn't do international community any favors, because now we know even less about Russian red lines.
We have time for maybe 2 more questions. Tim, do we have anybody watching at home, WACNH folks?
Yeah, we do have a question if you want to go here, or we can stay in the room.
Sure, go for it.
Okay, so Steve from Newcastle is wondering about the impact of the long-term impact of giving up the weapons. Do you believe that this was the best path forward for Ukraine, or should they have reconsidered and negotiated a stronger resolution?
The question from one of our viewers online was whether Ukraine's decision to get rid of its nuclear weapons was ultimately the best decision, or whether they should have gone in another direction.
Yeah, that's a good one. I always get asked that, and there isn't an easy answer to that. Clearly, as I said in the beginning of this talk, the value or the meaning of policy decisions, in retrospect, they change, right? The meaning changes. Now, knowing what we know today, perhaps Ukraine would have done differently in the past. Under those circumstances, back in the early 90s, and knowing what leaders knew at that time, it was a prudent decision. It was a prudent decision. If Ukrainian leaders were more savvy, I would think, if they sort of knew the layout of international sort of security structures and so forth, they would have gotten rid of these warheads, right? Possibly they would have stayed out of NPT, like India and Pakistan, and maintained some kind of sub-threshold nuclear industry. Iran is a member of the NPT.
Right.
So, for what it's worth. But, Ukraine had a claim that it was a successor state to the Soviet Union, which was a recognized nuclear state. NPT really did not accommodate that kind of situation very well, right? So it could have stayed out. It would have probably, United States wouldn't have liked it, but then it would have blown over. And then if you were trying to be also an aspiring democracy, then, kind of cooperation might have resumed. Administrations change. Suddenly there's George W. Bush. Maybe he doesn't care about that much anymore. He thinks he could, Ukraine sends troops to Afghanistan and Iraq, and suddenly Ukraine is on the good side. You never know how these things play out, right? But Ukraine certainly could have kept what we in kind of the field called latency. So not having a bomb, not really having a nuclear weapons program, but having enough things in place that you can quickly mobilize and keep it. And that's not precisely so much to deter and scare your adversary as possibly keep the eyes of your potential partners and allies glued very, very closely to you and your security predicament. And because that was precisely South African model. South Africa had 6.5 bombs. Like, what are you going to deter with that? But United States always paid attention and prevented any kind of escalation in the region because it didn't want to mess.
Sir in the back.
This is about the difference in perception of potential opponents, that they believe you're going to keep your word and do what you say you're going to do. Just one of these gentlemen over here was asking about why did he not follow through with something. About the last week I saw a 4-hour PBS documentary on radio. And what I noticed is when the Soviet Union was falling apart, potential opponents being worried about how we're going to act. I just noticed the contrast.
The question is about credibility and how leaders kind of personify that, and comparing Reagan in the 80s to Obama in the early 2010s, and the unpredictability or the perceived unpredictability of leaders' decision making and how adversaries react to that.
So that's a very good kind of historical precedent to bring about. And I think what I, as a historian, what I notice a lot reading through, Cuban Missile Crisis documents through the early 80s and Reagan era and the SDI, I noticed just how much resolve there was. And then suddenly, the early 90s were this time of the end of history, right? The superpower standoff, it ended, the Cold War ended. There was a lot of optimism and a lot of sort of expectations that there's kind of this unstoppable march of democracy around the world. And suddenly, within a couple of years, U.S. Nuclear scientists were going to Soviet nuclear labs and vice versa. I mean, something that was inconceivable just a few years before. Some of the most secret facilities that developed nuclear weapons, suddenly there was transparency. And I think we are still in the hangover of those times. But I think perhaps in a longer perspective, that time in the 90s, that time of close cooperation between US and Russia and this cooperative threat reduction, so-called, that was an exception rather than the rule. That was kind of a crack in the system there, where there was an opportunity for Russia to democratize, to develop, but that window of opportunity was amazingly short. By 1993, Yeltsin was already on the tank shooting at his own parliament and killed 100 and something people in that coup, whereas the coup in 1991 killed 2 or 4, So it was already, and then the first Chechnya War and the second Chechnya War. And I think that space really closed very quickly, and I think perhaps the focus also shifted away from Russia and into the Pacific theater, and China started coming online, and that was kind of the preeminent threat or competitor now, peer competitor, and so attentions and expertise and that kind of sense of resolve that dissipated. In Washington and elsewhere in the capitals of Europe. And I think perhaps even these blind spots, right, not being able to stand up firmly early on, because it's always cheaper to deter. It's less costly to deter with determination and resolve up front than to then deal with a hot war, like in Ukraine. You're absolutely right. I mean, the appetite for support is going down. It's not a crazy thing. I mean, U.S. taxpayers don't want to keep dishing out money, billions of dollars, into a never-ending war, although it's not never-ending. It will end, of course, all wars do. But it's a difficult argument to make. But the livelihood and lives of hundreds of thousands of people depend on that decision. And so I think the lesson for all of us is, it might not be a bad thing to regain that resolve. I mean, we praise President Kennedy for being so prudent and not invading Cuba, because that would have turned into, a nuclear war. And his American University speech, where he said, we must not, choose the course of action where the adversary has a choice between nuclear war and one of those really kind of magnanimous things, like give your adversary a face-saving solution. Let's not forget, and if you read the tapes from the White House in the 13 days, Kennedy got exactly what he wanted. He reversed the fait accompli, which is nearly impossible in international relations. The missiles were already there in Cuba. He got the Soviets to get those missiles out by using a military blockade. That was a military action. He called it quarantine to kind of soften it around the edges. But today, we would find that so hawkish. You reread that our risk tolerance dropped way down. And I would love to live in the world where, you know, that kind of resolve and that kind of risk tolerance could be, you know, could be rather medium or low. But unfortunately, our adversaries don't live in that world. Unfortunately, our adversaries do take risks. And whatever you think about Putin, even if he thought it was going to be a walk in the woods and Kiev would fall in 3 days and all of that, ordering 200,000 troops across an international border is no trifling thing. It takes a lot of resolve. It's a huge risk. And he went for it, and none of us were really ready.
I think we're going to have to wrap it up there, so we have time for our reception. Please join us downstairs for wine and refreshments. Please buy Mariana's book. You can Inheriting the Bomb. That's Budjeryn. Available on Amazon, everywhere else. So please join us downstairs, and I'm sure Mariana will be happy to answer your questions in person. But thank you again for joining us, both here and online.